So we now want to discuss the rules that are associated with the real numbers. There are three rules that no matter what you can do with any real number. And the first rule is that you can graph any real number on the real number line. Pretty fancy here. Here's my real number line, and we are allowed to graph any number. We can graph the number 3. And so I can put 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and if I want to graph the number 3, we just put a dot on number 3. It's important that you remember to label. If you don't label, we may not know exactly what you mean. For example, if I told you to graph the number 3/5, well, we know 3/5. If you type that into your calculator, it comes out to be 0.6. So that's about right here. But if we never labeled, we probably wouldn't know that's what you meant. So always remember to label on the real number line, or else it makes it very complicated to know exactly what you're doing. The number pi. Are we allowed to graph the number pi on the real number line? It comes out to be about 3.141592 ... It goes on forever. Can we graph it? Of course, that's our first rule. The rule is that any real number you can graph on the real number line. Just make sure that you label. So now it's your turn to practice. I'm going to give you 5 numbers that we'd like you to graph on the real number line. You can do it all on the same graph if you'd like. Take out your video notebook and graph these numbers. 10/3, -3.7, 4.78, square root of 2, and negative pi. Make sure to label your answers. When you're ready to check your answers, go ahead and resume the video. Okay, how'd you do? So 10/3, that could be kind of a misleading number. 10/3, you could simplify this. It would become 3 1/3, or you could use your calculator, of course, and do 10 divided by 3. That'll help us realize that it's about 3.33333. So we can go ahead and graph that on the real number line right about here. And I would label that as 10/3. Let me change my color here just for fun. I want to graph it here, and that I'm going to label as 10/3. Okay, -3.7, that would be between -3 and -4. And so we'd go ahead and graph that. I'd put it closer to 4, just because it is closer to 4 than to 3. 4.78, that's kind of off our graph here. We could write it in there. The square root of 2. Now, if you don't know the square root of 2, it'd be a good idea to come in and use the square root button on your calculator. You'll want to find where that is. On my calculator, I need to push the yellow button, square root, and then push 2 and push the enter. And so it's about 1.414. So that's in between 1 and 2. So I'd put that right there, put square root of 2 to label it. And last of all, negative pi. Negative pi is -3.1415. And so that's about right here, really close to the -3.7. I'd go ahead and write in negative pi and graph it like that. How'd you do? Make sure to check your answer. Okay, the next law for real numbers, the first law was graphing. The next law for real numbers is the law of trichotomy. Ooh, sounds like a scary thing, but it's not scary at all. In fact, it just comes from tri, meaning that there's 3 options. For any 2 real numbers you pull out of a hat, doesn't matter what 2 numbers, you can always compare those 2 numbers with each other. For example, maybe I'll pull out the number -3 and pull out the number 7. There's always 3 possibilities when comparing these 2 numbers. You can either use a less than sign, an equal to sign, or a greater than sign. That's the law of trichotomy. You use one of these signs to compare 2 real numbers. In this situation, we would pick -3 is less than 7. If you ever forget your less than, which one is less than, you can do the same thing like if you hold up your hand. If you hold up your hand, you can know which one is left by looking at your hand. So notice that if you hold up your left hand, you will see that your finger, your index finger and your thumb form an L. And so that's how I always remember which direction is left, because that's your left hand. But you can also remember that it's L for less than. To help you remember which one is less than and greater than. Okay, great. So let's have you guys try a couple laws of trichotomies here. Okay, so here are 6 problems we'd like you to do in your video notebook. Please take out the notebook and write these problems down and fill in the blanks here with one of the laws of trichotomy. Either use a less than sign, an equal to sign, or a greater than sign. Go ahead and pause this video and push the play button when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, so how'd you do? Here we're going to be looking at which one is less than, which one's greater than. So here negative 8 is less than 8 for sure. So you should have used a greater than sign because 8 is greater than negative 8. Negative 5 and negative 11, which one's smaller? Well, sometimes I like to think of this as debt. If I had negative $5 or negative $11, which is smaller? Well, negative 11, that's bad. So negative 5 would be better than negative 11. Here, 2.14 is greater than 1.24. We have negative 1/2 and negative 2/3. Again, you could use your calculator to get decimal values for these. If I did 1 divided by 2 and put a negative on there, negative 1 divided by 2, I could get the decimal value. This would be negative 0.5. And if I did negative 2 divided by 3, that would be negative 0.6 repeating. So in that situation, we would say that the negative 0.5 is greater than 0.6666. Here you can simplify 15 over 5. That just simplifies to 3. This one is equal. And this last one here, these fractions again, I'm going to go ahead and convert those. I'm going to do negative 13 divided by 16. I'm going to get this decimal form here. That's negative 0.8125. Negative 0.8125. And negative 5/9. So negative 5 divided by 9 comes out to be negative 0.5555. And that is greater than negative 0.8125. Good. How'd you do? Hopefully you did well. Let's move on to the last law that we need to talk about. Before we do the last law, there's one last thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to the law of trichotomy. When we have a number, for example, 5 is greater than negative 3, you are allowed to write inequalities in backwards. You can flip inequality. So I could actually write this same thing as negative 3 is less than 5. Do understand that if you flip an inequality, you do need to change the direction of the sign. So that's for flipping inequalities. The last topic we want to talk about when dealing with real numbers is something called the absolute value. Now, the absolute value is a measure of distance. So let's do an example here on the map really quick. Here's Rexburg. If I were to travel about 15 miles in the north direction on Highway 20, we'd arrive in St. Anthony. And if I were to ask you what distance have I traveled, you would say, well, 15 miles. Good. Now, if I were to drive, say, 20 miles south, driving 20 miles south is going to make me end up in Idaho Falls. And I'd say, what is the distance I just traveled? And you tell me, well, the distance from Rexburg to Idaho Falls is 20 miles. Something that's really important here is that when talking about distance, distance is always a positive value. We would never say, oh, I just traveled negative 10 miles out of Rexburg. That wouldn't make very much sense. And so this is very important when talking about distance. Distance is always a positive value. And so when dealing with the absolute value of a number, the absolute value of a number is the distance that number is away from 0. Let's take an example of the number 5. So if we have a value, for example, the number 5, and I was to ask you, what is the distance that this number is away from 0? Maybe 0 is where we put our home here. Whoop, I got a nice little home. What is the distance from 0? Well, you would tell me that the distance is 5 units. From here to here is 5 units. Now, if I were to ask you the same question about negative 5, this value over here, and I said, what is the distance away that negative 5 is from 0? Well, you would also say 5 units. because distance is always a positive value. Please note that when we deal with absolute value, the symbol for absolute value is two straight up and down lines. And if I ask you, what is the absolute value of 5, it's asking you the distance to 0, which is just 5. And if I ask you, what's the absolute value of -5, well, that's just the distance to 0. That is also 5. Any value in an absolute value, once we figure it out, will always be positive because we're talking about distance. So what is the absolute value of -3? It would be 3. What's the absolute value of 7? 7, because it's 7 units away from 0. So for our last assignment, let's have you try some absolute value problems. We'd like you to try the absolute value of -4, the absolute value of 1003, the absolute value of -3.7, and also we'd like you to try the absolute value of -2/3, the absolute value of 0, and one last one, the absolute value of 14.7. Go ahead and pause your video and write these problems down in your video notebook. There's 6 of them, and answer them. Let's see if you can find the absolute value, remembering that absolute value means distance. Pause the video and resume it when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, how'd you do? Absolute value means distance, and so that means our answers will always come out positive. It's the distance to 0. This would be 4. The answer to the absolute value of 1003 would just be 1003. Absolute value of -3.7, well, that would just be 3.7. The absolute value of -2/3 would be 2/3. Absolute value of 0, that's just 0. Absolute value of 14.7 is 14.7. So the moral of the story there is that an absolute value will always spit out a positive number. So if your number is positive, it's just going to be that answer. If it's negative, just take off the negative because we're talking about distance. Hello and welcome to section where we will be discussing addition and subtraction of real numbers. The best way to remember addition is that addition always moves us to the right on the number line, and subtraction always moves us to the left on the number line. Let me bring up a virtual number line and show you what that means. So here's a real number line, and notice that addition, one way to think of addition, for example, if I had the number 3 and I wanted to add 5 to that, is movement on the number line. We would move right 3 units and then move right 5 more units because we're adding the numbers together. We can also think of this with negative numbers. If I wanted to take the number 7 and add the number -4, well, that's the same as subtraction. Whenever you see a plus and a negative together in a problem, that just means subtraction. In fact, you can take the plus out and just leave a subtraction sign there. Remember, subtraction moves us to the left. So we started at 7, and then -4 moves us to the left. This can get kind of complicated when we start using multiple negatives. For example, the number -4 minus the number -3 actually moves us even farther to the left. We start at -4 and then move 3 more units to the left because it's negative. Again, when a plus and a minus are together, you can just write that as one negative. Good. So let's take a look at one more. For example, if I had -8 and I wanted to add 4 to that, so notice the -8 moves us to the left 8, and then the +4 moves us back to the right 4 units. So we would do -8 + 4 gets us -4. Let's take a look at when subtracting. So when subtracting, if I had 4 minus 2, well, this is an easy problem here. We go to the right 4, and then we subtract 2, which moves us back to the left 2 units to give us 2. Now, what happens when we subtract a negative number? When we go 4 minus a -5, notice that we have a double negative here. And whenever you have a double negative, you should turn that sign, both those signs, into plus. So when there's a plus and a minus, you're going to leave that as minus. When there is a minus, or an opposite of an opposite, that's plus. So we went 4 units to the right, and then went an additional 5 units to the right to get 9. 4 minus a negative 5 is positive 9. And you, again, sometimes can write the minus minus as a positive. Well, we can go negative 7 minus a negative 5. So take a look at this. So I've got negative 7, so I start going to the left 7 units. That's where I'm going to start. And then I do minus a negative 5. Again, a minus a negative is going to be a positive. And so that's going to move us back to the right 5 units, leaving us with an answer of negative 2. Now this applet here there is a link to this if you'd like to play around with it yourself and drag these back and forth kind of to see what happens as things move to the left and right. Notice here negative 7 minus 6 makes us more negative. We start at negative 7 and then we go 6 more units to the left. Remember, minus moves us left, addition moves us plus. This applet's available to you to play around with to kind of get an idea of how addition and subtraction of integers moves us up and down or left and right on the number line. So let's take a look at these 3 examples here. Here I have on this first one, negative 17 minus 25. So I would, if I were doing this in my head or on a piece of paper, thinking of it moving left and right, this would be start at negative 17. So go to the left 17 and then go left 25 more. In that situation, because they're both left, I would add the numbers together, the absolute value of the numbers, 17 plus 25, which would get me 42. And because I was moving to the left, it would be negative 42. Here I'm starting on this next one, negative 3. I start at the left, but then I have a negative and a negative. So remember, 2 negatives together makes it positive. So I would actually change these signs, and I'd say, okay, well, this is negative 3 to the left, and here we have a plus 5. Well, that moves us to the right. So if I went negative 3 left and then 5 to the right, well, that would get me 2 to the right. So my answer there would be positive 2. On the next one here I'm 7 units to the left plus 2 more units going to the left. That's going to be negative 9. That one looked just like the first one. Now you can use a calculator to do this as well. So there's no shame in using a calculator. Let's get familiar with our calculators. You should be able to identify the negative button. Please understand that the negative button is different than the subtraction button. They're different. You can even see that they're different in size. You have to be aware of that, or your calculator is not going to understand which one you're doing. So please remember to know the difference between your negative button and your subtraction button. So let's go ahead and type these in. If I were to do this first problem here, I'd go negative 17 plus a negative 25. We'd push the enter button and we get our answer. Okay. On this other one, it was negative 3 minus a negative 5. So I would do negative 3 minus a negative 5. I push the enter button and I get 2. On this next one here, we would just do negative 7 plus a negative 2, which gets us negative 9. Remember that you can use a calculator to do addition and subtraction of negative numbers, so negative and positive numbers. Okay, let's give you some to work on here for your video notebook. Okay, so here are 6 problems for you to work on. Take out your video notebook and go ahead and work on adding and subtracting these real numbers. Feel free to use your calculator. Make sure that you check your answers at the end here. Every calculator works a little different, so you may have to play around with it. If you're not feeling very comfortable with your calculator, make sure to stop by the Tutor Center, either online or in person, so that they can help you get an idea of what buttons to push for your calculator. You're also free to do these by hand if you'd like to make sure that you're doing them right. Go ahead and pause the video now and push the play button when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, hopefully you've tried these problems now and are ready to proceed. Again, you can use your calculator to do these problems if you'd like. For this first one, you just type in negative 4 plus 8 and you get 4. On the next one, it would be 8 minus a negative 10. You get 18. Again, here's an example of where you could go wrong. If you typed in 8 and used a minus instead of a negative, look what's going to happen. The calculator is going to say error. Sometimes it'll give you an answer and it will be wrong. So don't mix up the negatives and the subtractions. It was the correct answer on the correct way to type that in would be 8 minus a negative 10. Okay, good. Let's continue. The next one was negative 3 plus a negative 4, which gets me negative 7. For these ones over here, we would do negative 3/4. Remember that you can use the ABC button in your calculator to represent fractions. Minus 2/3. We get negative 17/12. After that, we have negative 1.5 minus a negative 3.5, which gets us 2. Again, you can think of this as moving left and right. If I were to take this problem, I would start left, negative 1.5. A double negative means that these are plus, which means I'm actually moving right. So I would do 3.5 minus 1.5 because it's moving left to find out how far right I move over. Notice that the right number is bigger, and so my answer is going to be positive or right if you're thinking of moving left and right. On the last one here, we would do 4/18 minus 5/6, and we would get our answer of negative 11/18. And so that's how we would do those 6 problems. Again, that's using addition and subtraction of rational numbers. And that is our lesson for the day. There are some word problems that you can use in this. For example, one word problem could include. So here's a word problem that consists of elevation. For example, Mount McKinley is the highest point in North America. Its altitude is 20,328 feet. And the lowest point, anybody know? You bet. Death Valley in California, which is about 200 feet below zero. So the question is if you traveled from Death Valley all the way to the top of Mount McKinley, what is the difference or the change in altitude? So again, the idea there is difference. The word difference means subtraction. And so the problem that we have here to set up is 20,328 feet minus, because we're doing the difference. And then we have Death Valley, which is 200 feet below sea level. And so we would need to mark that as a negative because it's negative 200 feet because it's below that sea level. And so as we work that out, that would be then how we get the answer for the difference in the change of altitude. We would do minus a negative 200. This often also happens in temperature because you can have temperatures that are above zero and temperatures that are negative. And there's other examples in the real world where this appears. And so for this answer, we would say that the difference in altitude is 20,528. So here's an example for you. Another place where we see positive and negative numbers is in football. You bet. You can have positive yardage and negative yardage. Let's say on the first attempt, a team runs and gets an 8-yard gain. An 8-yard gain. And then on the second opportunity, the second down, that team gets sacked and loses 12 yards. A 12-yard loss. Then on third down, on the third opportunity, they do a pass and get a 7-yard gain. And then on fourth down, they decide to go for it and get another 6-yard gain. The question is, what would be the total yards gained or loss in these 4 plays? Go ahead and pause the video, give this a try, make sure that you can get the positive and the negatives all worked out, and then resume the video when you're ready to check your answer. Okay, how'd you do? This one's not too complicated. You can simply add the numbers together. We're going to use gain to be positive numbers, and then add a negative 12-yard loss because they lost 12 yards. You could also just put subtraction if you wanted to. You don't have to put plus and negative. I could have just done 8 minus 12 plus 7 plus 6. Remember, plus a negative, whenever we do plus a negative, that's the same thing as subtraction. So don't let plus a negative mess you up. Plus a negative is the same thing as a subtraction. Plus a negative number is subtraction. And minus a negative number is addition, because those two signs will cancel out. Okay, well, thanks for joining us in this lesson. We will see you in the next.